In August 1945, the Japanese Empire collapsed overnight. For 35 years, Japan had colonized the Korean Peninsula, suppressing its culture and systematically stripping its resources. Suddenly, liberation had arrived, but it left a massive vacuum of power. To manage the surrender of Japanese forces, two junior American military officers, Dean Rusk and Charles Bonesteel, were tasked with dividing the peninsula into temporary U.S. and Soviet occupation zones. Using only a National Geographic map and without consulting a single Korean, they drew a line straight across the 38th parallel. What was intended to be a temporary administrative boundary quickly hardened under Cold War tensions. By 1948, the peninsula was split into two rival governments, a Soviet-backed communist state in the north and a U.S.-backed republic in the south. An abstract geographical decision made thousands of miles away had severed a nation that had been unified for centuries. War on the peninsula was now highly predictable, if not inevitable. On June 25, 1950, North Korean forces, equipped with Soviet tanks and artillery, launched a surprise invasion across the border. The South Korean army was entirely unprepared, lacking armor and anti-tank weaponry. Seoul fell in just 72 hours. In Washington, President Harry Truman viewed the Blitzkrieg as a direct challenge to the post-war international system. Allowing the aggression to go unchecked carried direct parallels to the appeasement policies of the 1930s. The response was remarkably swift. Within days, the United Nations Security Council passed resolutions 83 and 84, condemning the attack and organizing an international military coalition, led by the United States, to repel the invasion. This historic international mobilization was only possible because of a geopolitical anomaly. The Soviet Union was boycotting the Security Council to protest the UN's refusal to seat the newly formed Communist government of China. Absent from the chamber, Moscow could not use its veto power. Outgunned and disorganized, South Korean and arriving UN forces retreated rapidly down the peninsula. Within weeks, they were backed into a small defensive pocket on the southeastern coast, known as the Pusan Perimeter. To break the stalemate at Pusan, the commander of UN forces, General Douglas MacArthur, conceived a massive amphibious assault far behind enemy lines at the port city of Inchon. Military planners in Washington strongly opposed the idea. Inchon Harbor was notoriously treacherous. Its tidal variations reached 30 feet, meaning landing craft would have only a fleeting 6-hour window to strike before being stranded on vast mudflats. Operation Chromite launched on September 15th. The element of surprise was absolute. UN forces stormed the beaches, swiftly recapturing Seoul and severing the North Korean army's supply lines, sending them into full retreat. Riding the momentum of this tactical victory, UN and South Korean forces pushed aggressively north, crossing the original 38th parallel border. The objective shifted from defending the south to conquering the north and unifying the peninsula. But this rapid advance toward the Chinese border would trigger a massive retaliation. As American and UN forces neared the Yalu River, China felt a direct threat to its borders. Mao Zedong made the calculated decision to intervene. For Mao, sending the Chinese People's Volunteer Army into Korea protected his borders from American encirclement, demonstrated ideological solidarity with a fellow communist state, and proved China's worth to Joseph Stalin to secure vital Soviet economic and military aid. In late November 1950, hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops struck out from the freezing mountains, surrounding UN forces at the Chosin Reservoir. The troops were caught in a brutal encirclement, fighting in sub-zero winter conditions. The extreme cold paralyzed both sides, weapons malfunctioned, and the ground was too hard to dig defensive trenches. In one instance, a desperate radio request for 60mm mortar ammunition using the codename Tootsie Rolls resulted in supply planes dropping crates of actual Tootsie Roll candies to the stranded men. The victorious march north had evaporated. The Korean conflict became a desperate, freezing fight for survival against overwhelming numbers and an unforgiving environment. As Chinese forces advanced, UN troops and tens of thousands of terrified North Korean civilians fled to the eastern coast for a massive maritime withdrawal known as the Hungnam Evacuation. Among the fleet was the SS Meredith Victory, an American cargo freighter originally built to transport overseas supplies, with a capacity of just 12 passengers. Recognizing the gravity of the situation, Captain Leonard LaRue made a fateful decision. Using makeshift elevators and booms, the crew packed 14,000 Korean civilians into the 5 cargo holds and across the main deck, standing shoulder to shoulder in the bitter cold. Unescorted and carrying almost no food or water, the freighter navigated treacherous waters for 3 days. Not a single life was lost during the journey. Instead, 5 babies were born on board. Surrounded by a landscape of mass slaughter and calculated geopolitical maneuvering, the Meredith victory stood as an extraordinary assertion of preserved humanity. By mid-1951, the sweeping peninsula-wide offensives ground to a halt. The front line stabilized almost exactly where the war had begun, near the 38th parallel. The conflict descended into a static, brutal war of attrition. Soldiers on both sides dug deep into the mountainous terrain, living in muddy, reinforced trenches for months on end. At locations like Bloody Ridge and Pork Chop Hill, thousands of men were killed or wounded fighting over isolated outposts, often exchanging the exact same yards of ruined earth multiple times. The tactical momentum of the early war was gone. Soldiers were trapped in a claustrophobic hell of artillery and mud, while leaders across the globe debated their fate from safe distances. Formal armistice negotiations opened in July 1951, but the talks dragged on for 2 agonizing years. As diplomats argued over terms and prisoner exchanges, men continued to die on the front lines. Behind closed doors in Moscow, Joseph Stalin actively encouraged Mao and North Korean leader Kim Il-sung to refuse compromises and keep the war going. For Stalin, the Korean conflict was highly advantageous. It forced the United States to expend massive amounts of military resources and manpower in Asia, all without risking Soviet soldiers in direct combat. The diplomatic stalling translated directly to a mounting death toll. Frontline soldiers and civilians were utilized as pawns in a long-term Cold War strategy of exhaustion. After the death of Stalin removed a primary obstacle to negotiations, an Armistice Agreement was signed on July 27, 1953. It established a ceasefire and created the demilitarized zone. But a final peace settlement was never achieved. Technically, a state of war still exists between North and South Korea today. This chart shows the long-term economic trajectories of the 2 nations following the ceasefire. Over the decades, South Korea experienced rapid, exponential GDP growth, integrating tightly into the global economy. In stark contrast, North Korea's economic data flatlined under decades of impoverished isolation. Beyond the macroeconomics lies the human cost. The ceasefire formalized the tragedy of Isan Gajok, the millions of Korean families permanently severed from their relatives by an impassable border. Millions of lives were sacrificed in a brutal conflict that ultimately moved an abstract border just a few miles. The Korean War left an open wound on the peninsula, a permanent, militarized division that continues to shape the modern world.